Please don't push me, Mommy. I won't tell Daddy, I promise. Zoe Torres was 6 years old and standing on a fourth-floor balcony in Scottsdale, Arizona, with her fingers locked around an iron railing and nothing but 12 meters of empty desert air between her and the granite below. The voice behind her didn't yell, didn't rush. It came out the way someone orders coffee, and that's what made it terrifying. Then jump. Genevieve Ashford stepped closer. Perfume heavy and expensive. Completely wrong for the heat. Completely wrong for what she was about to do. A hand pressed into the center of the girl's back. Not a violent shove. Something worse. A steady push like sliding a chair under a table. Zoe's fingers slipped. The sky flipped. And at that exact second, the iron gate below swung open, and a black Maybach rolled in. And Ryland Torres, the man half of Arizona's underworld, answered to, looked up through the windshield, and saw his daughter falling in a white dress that caught the sun like a flag. He didn't think. He killed the engine, through the door, and ran with his eyes locked on the only thing he'd ever loved without conditions. His hands caught her waist and he pulled her into his chest so hard they both hit the ground, his back cracking against dirt and cactus thorns ripping through his suit. But his arms didn't open, not 1 inch. Zoe gasped, "Daddy." Then she said the words that split his world in half. "Mommy V pushed me. Daddy. I didn't jump. I didn't." Ryland Torres had buried rivals without losing sleep. But lying in the dirt with his daughter's heartbeat against his ribs, he understood that the most dangerous enemy he'd ever faced had been sleeping in his bed, kissing his child goodnight with the same hands that just tried to kill her. And for the first time in his life, power meant nothing, because the war was inside his own house. If that hit you right in the chest, you're in the right place. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the woman about to walk through his front door as the new nanny is carrying a secret that could save his daughter, or burn everything he has left to the ground. Ryland didn't call 911. An ordinary man would have called, would have shouted into the phone, would have let the sirens come and the red and blue lights spin in front of the gate. But Ryland Torres wasn't an ordinary man. He was a man who had built an empire out of darkness, and the first instinct of darkness is to never invite the light inside. Police meant reports. Reports meant questions. Questions meant the FBI knocking. And the FBI knocking meant everything he had built over 20 years would collapse in a single night. So he lifted Zoe into his arms, crossed the stone courtyard without looking back at the fourth-floor balcony, opened the rear door of the Maybach, placed his daughter in the passenger seat, then slid behind the wheel himself in a torn suit with dried blood on both hands. Zoe refused to stay in her seat. She crawled across, climbed onto his lap, wrapped both arms around his neck, and pressed her face into his shoulder, as if the half-meter between the seats was already too far, already enough for someone to snatch her away again. Ryland didn't pull her off. He drove with one hand, the other holding her back, and the two of them left Torres Estate in silence, with only the engine humming and the small, rapid breaths of a 6-year-old pressed against his ear. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." Zoe repeated the word without forming a sentence or meaning, just a sound she clung to like a drowning person clings to a piece of wood, as if stopping meant letting go, meant falling one more time. Ryland heard it and didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because his throat was locked tight, because every time the word daddy reached his ear, the image of a white dress falling in the sunlight flashed behind his eyes, and he had to swallow it down to keep the road in focus. Scottsdale in the afternoon looked like a postcard. Camelback Road stretched under golden light, jewelry stores and art galleries lining both sides with spotless glass fronts, white SUVs parked neatly in front of cafes, people in athletic clothes laughing on the sidewalks as if there was nothing in this world to fear. A woman pushed a stroller across the crosswalk. 2 children ran out of an ice cream shop with chocolate smeared across their faces. An old man sat reading a newspaper under the shade of a Palo Verde tree. Everything was normal. Everything was so normal that Ryland felt like he was driving through someone else's dream, a dream he didn't belong to, because inside this car, nothing was normal. Inside this car was the smell of dried blood on his hands, the scent of dirt and cactus spines still caught in the fabric on his back, the sound of his daughter calling him like a countdown, and the cold weight in his stomach when he knew the person who had pushed his child from the balcony was still in his house, still breathing, still thinking of an explanation. He didn't remember how many red lights he passed. He didn't remember where he turned. He only remembered that when the sign for Scottsdale Osborne Medical Center appeared ahead, Zoe stopped saying daddy and fell silent, And that silence was more frightening than crying, because when a 6-year-old stops calling for help, it isn't because the fear is gone, but because it has lasted so long the body accepts it as part of itself. Ryland pulled up directly in front of the emergency entrance. No need to search for parking. No card. No permission. Nothing but 2 fast-moving legs, and his daughter in his arms. He shoved the door open with his elbow, wrapped both arms around Zoe, and walked toward the white lights of the hospital looking like a man who had just stepped off a battlefield, because that was exactly what had happened. Except the battlefield wasn't out on the street, but on the 4th floor of the house he had called home. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss and cold air hit Ryland's face along with an antiseptic smell so sharp he felt it cling to his tongue. The harsh white fluorescent lights of the emergency room were nothing like the golden sunlight outside, as if he had stepped from one world into another, and in this world everything was sharp, clean, and cold to the point of indifference. A security guard looked him up and down, then stopped at the torn suit, the red dust on his shoulder, the dried blood on his hands, and the 6-year-old wrapped around his neck, as if being pried loose would mean death. The man reached for his radio, but Ryland spoke first, his voice not loud, yet every word cut like a blade. My child fell from the 4th floor. I caught her. I need a doctor to check her right now. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was an order, and the way he said it made the guard ask nothing further before turning to call a nurse. In less than a minute, they were surrounded. A gurney appeared as if rising from the floor. Nurses in blue clustered in. Someone pulled on gloves. Someone held a small flashlight. Someone asked the child's name and age. Ryland answered in short, clipped phrases. But when a nurse reached for Zoe's arm to place her on the gurney, everything stopped. Zoe tightened her grip around Ryland's neck until he could barely breathe, her whole body going rigid like a small animal cornered, and her voice came out high and thin, breaking halfway through. "Don't leave me, Daddy. Don't leave me, please." Ryland closed his eyes for a second. He had been shot in the left shoulder during a hit in South Phoenix 7 years earlier, the bullet tearing through his deltoid and lodging near the bone, and he remembered that pain clearly. But it wasn't even a tenth of what he felt now, as he had to peel his daughter's tiny fingers away from his collar one by one. He laid Zoe onto the gurney, held her face between both hands, looked straight into her eyes, and spoke slowly so she could hear every word. "Daddy is right here. Daddy isn't going anywhere, but the doctors have to check if anything hurts. Do you understand? I promise I'll be right outside this curtain." Zoe didn't nod, but she didn't cling anymore either, lying back on the gurney with her eyes wide and fixed on his face, until the blue curtain was pulled shut and cut him from her sight. Ryland stood outside that curtain, and for the first time in his life, understood what true helplessness felt like. Not the helplessness of lacking money or manpower, but the helplessness of a boss standing 3 steps away from his daughter, and being able to do nothing but wait. He heard Dr. Catherine Reyes speaking inside, her voice calm and professional, asking Zoe to raise her arms, bend her head, turn her body. He heard the steady beep of the heart monitor and Zoe's soft whimper when someone touched her back. Then silence. Silence that stretched longer than normal. The curtain opened, and Dr. Reyes stepped out, her face no longer holding its initial calm. She looked at Ryland and said, "Mr. Torres, there are no broken bones. No internal injuries. She's very lucky." Ryland exhaled, but she wasn't finished. "But I found something else." She led him back inside, gently lifted Zoe's shirt, and Ryland saw it. In the middle of his daughter's back, just beneath her shoulder blade, was a dark bruise in the clear shape of an adult hand, 5 fingers defined as if printed onto her skin. Fresh, new, no more than a few hours old. Not a bruise from a fall, not a bruise from impact. It was the mark of a hand pressed into a child's back with enough force to push her over a railing. Dr. Reyes continued, her voice lower but without hesitation. "Under Arizona Revised Statutes 13-3-6-20, I am required to make a mandatory report to Child Protective Services. I don't have the authority to overlook this evidence no matter who you are." Ryland didn't look at her. He was looking at the bruise. The handprint on Zoe's back was smaller than his. Slender fingers, a narrow palm, a woman's hand. A hand he knew exactly who it belonged to. The anger didn't explode loudly. There was no shouting, no fist slamming into a wall. It sank instead. Slow, cold, heavy, like ink dropped into water, spreading through his chest and settling at the bottom. It was the kind of anger of a man accustomed to solving problems not with emotion but with silence, with planning, with the patience to wait for the exact moment and strike only once. He turned to Dr. Reyes and said, "Just one thing. Do what you need to do, but give me time with my daughter first." Then he sat down beside the gurney, took Zoe's hand, and said nothing more. But in his mind, another war had already begun, a war without guns or territory, with only one man, one child, and an enemy on the way to this hospital wearing fake red eyes and carrying a perfectly rehearsed story. Genevieve arrived at the hospital 23 minutes after Ryland, and she arrived with a performance so perfect that anyone who didn't know the truth would have wanted to hold her and cry along with her. Her eyes were red, not the red of someone who had just finished crying, but the red of someone who had cried the entire drive. The lower lids wet, mascara smudged just enough to look pitiful without looking messy, her hands covering her face, then dropping, then lifting again, as if she couldn't control her emotions, her voice trembling yet still clear enough for everyone in the emergency room to hear every word. She rushed to Ryland, grabbed his arm, and began to explain at a carefully measured pace. Not too fast to seem like fake panic, not too slow to seem suspiciously calm. She said she didn't know what happened, that Zoe climbed onto the balcony by herself, that she was in the room when she heard the glass door open, that she ran out, but was too late, that she tried to pull Zoe back, but the child slipped from her grasp, that she screamed but no one heard, that she was terrified and thought she had lost the child. The tears came at exactly the right moment. Her voice broke in exactly the right places. Her shoulders shook in exactly the right rhythm. A nurse walking past stopped and looked at her with sympathy, then handed her a box of tissues. A mother waiting in a nearby chair shook her head and whispered to her husband that the poor woman was suffering so much. Genevieve accepted the tissues, pulled one out, dabbed her eyes gently, and said thank you in a choked voice, just strong enough to make the entire waiting area feel that she was a loving stepmother living through the worst nightmare of her life. Ryland didn't say a word. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and watched Genevieve perform. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't ask why or how. He simply watched. His jaw was clenched so tight the tendons stood out at his temples, yet his face showed no expression at all. No anger, no grief, nothing. And that nothing was the most frightening thing on the face of a man like him, because those in the underworld who had worked with Ryland Torres long enough knew that when he shouted, he was still giving a chance. But when he went silent and watched, it meant he had already decided, he just hadn't acted yet. Genevieve didn't notice that look because she was too busy playing her role. She knelt beside the gurney, lifted her hand to stroke Zoe's hair with long, slender fingers still carrying the scent of expensive perfume, the same hand that less than an hour earlier had pressed into the middle of the child's back, and she whispered that she was okay, that Mommy was so worried, that she was sorry. And that was the moment when every performance in the world became meaningless, because Zoe recoiled. Her entire body stiffened on the gurney, her shoulders hunched inward as if trying to disappear. Her hands clenched the edge of the hospital gown, and her eyes went wide with terror as she stared straight past Genevieve's shoulder, straight at Ryland, begging for help, not with words, but with the entire body of a 6-year-old, telling her father, "Please don't let this person touch me." No nurse understood that reaction. No mother in the waiting chairs understood that reaction. But Ryland understood it, clearly and sharply, like reading a sentence written in blood on his daughter's skin. Zoe's response told him more than any statement, more than any piece of evidence, more even than the hand-shaped bruise on her back, because a bruise could be explained away, but a child's fear when facing the person who pushed her couldn't be faked, and couldn't be explained by any story about balconies or wind or accidents. Ryland stepped forward, not fast, not slow, placed his hand on Genevieve's shoulder, and said in a voice flat as water before a storm that she should step outside and let the doctors work. Genevieve looked up, her eyes still wet, her lips still trembling, but she was smart enough not to argue at that moment. She stood, dabbed her eyes one more time, and walked out past the blue curtain, her high heels tapping softly on the hospital floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. When Genevieve disappeared behind the curtain, Ryland sat down beside Zoe, took his daughter's hand, and said nothing to anyone. But in his mind there was only one simple and absolute thought, that he wouldn't allow that woman to touch his daughter even one more time, even if he had to burn his entire empire to the ground to make it happen. Ryland Torres was the man the entire city of Scottsdale feared, the man whose name was whispered in dark rooms from Phoenix to Tucson. But in this hospital he was facing the most dangerous enemy of his life, and that enemy carried no gun, claimed no territory, commanded no soldiers, She had only tears and a beautiful face, and she was crying beautifully right beside his daughter's bed. 2 years earlier, on an October night when the desert wind blew with unusual cold, Celeste Lawson was found dead in the second-floor bathtub of Torretti Estate. The person who discovered her was the housekeeper, a man who had worked for the Torretti family for 15 years, and when he called Ryland, his voice was no longer that of a servant, but of someone who had just seen something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The water in the tub had gone cold. Celeste was wearing a white nightgown, her blonde hair spread across the surface of the water, her eyes closed, her lips slightly parted, looking as if she were asleep, if not for the gray tint of her skin, and the way her arms hung limp over the sides of the tub, as though she had let go of everything long before her body stopped breathing. On the sink counter sat an open bottle of antidepressants. Beside it, a half-finished glass of wine. There was no suicide note. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no external injuries. The Maricopa County coroner reached a conclusion within 48 hours. Suicide by overdose of medication combined with alcohol, with the underlying cause listed as prolonged postpartum depression that had not been adequately treated. The file stated clearly that Celeste had a history of depression, that she had seen a therapist twice and then stopped, that she had once told a friend she felt lonely inside her own home. Everything fit. Everything made sense. Everything was so neat that no one asked another question. Ryland was in Las Vegas at the time, sitting in the top-floor VIP room of a hotel on the Strip, handling a shipping deal worth tens of millions of dollars with a partner from California. When he took the call, he was holding a glass of whiskey. When he set the glass down, his hand did not shake, but everything inside him collapsed. He flew back to Scottsdale on his private jet, and during the entire flight he did not say a word, only stared into the darkness beyond the window and thought about the last time he had spoken to Celeste. 3 days earlier, on the phone, less than 2 minutes, he asked if she needed anything. She said no. He said he was busy, and then he hung up. 2 minutes. That was all he had given his wife in the final 3 days of her life. By the time he arrived home, everything was finished. The police had come, taken photos, written reports, and left. Celeste's body had been taken to the morgue. The bathtub had been cleaned, and Zoe, 4 years old, was asleep in her room with her thumb in her mouth, unaware that her mother would never come wake her in the morning again. Ryland stood in the empty bathroom, looked at the spotless tub, and knew he had to decide. If he allowed the police to dig deeper, they would search the house, they would find what should not be found, they would notify the FBI, and the FBI would tear the Torretti empire apart. He made 3 phone calls. 2 hours later, the file was closed. The conclusion remained unchanged, and no one asked anything further. He chose. He chose to protect the empire, instead of seeking the truth for the woman who had given birth to his child. And that decision became something he carried with him every night, heavier than any crime he had ever committed, because killing for power was something he could sleep with, but betraying the woman he loved for power was not, and he knew what that difference said about him even if he did not dare to think too deeply about it. 6 months later, at a charity gala in Paradise Valley, inside the ballroom of the Hermosa Inn with its chandeliers and champagne and wealthy faces smiling in practiced ways, Genevieve Ashford appeared. She wore an off-shoulder black gown, her dark brown hair swept up, gray-blue eyes, and a smile just sad enough to seem intriguing without appearing weak. She knew his name before he introduced himself. She asked about Zoe before he mentioned his child. She spoke about loss as if she too had lost someone, and the way she spoke about loneliness touched precisely the wound Ryland had been trying to hide from the world. She said nothing wrong. She did nothing excessive. She simply appeared at the right moment, said the right words, touched the right place, and Ryland, the man no one could deceive, allowed a woman to deceive him into his home, into his bed, into his daughter's life. In just 4 months. 4 months from the first glass of champagne to the marriage license at the Maricopa County Courthouse. 4 months for Genevieve Ashford to become Mrs. Torretti. And no one, including Ryland, asked the simplest question of all, where she came from. No one asked where she came from, but 110 miles to the south, in a shabby studio apartment in Tucson, there was a 27-year-old woman who asked that question every single day for 2 years. Brielle Lawson had no mansion, no Maybach, no empire. She had a 15-square-meter room on the 3rd floor of an old building, 2 blocks from Speedway Boulevard, with peeling ceilings, an air conditioner that roared like it was dying every summer night, and a narrow single bed whose springs had sunk in the middle. forming a hollow exactly shaped to her body because she slept in the same position for 2 years, curled inward, face pressed into the pillow, the same way she used to lie when she was small, and Celeste held her from behind whenever storms came. Celeste was everything Brielle had. Their parents died on Interstate 10 when Brielle was 8, and Celeste was 17, an 18-wheeler losing control at 3 in the morning near Benson, both girls asleep in the back seat, and waking up in Tucson Medical Center with a nurse, telling them their parents didn't make it. Brielle doesn't remember clearly what happened after that, but she remembers one thing: Celeste's hand holding hers from the hospital to the funeral home to the social services office to the first foster house, and that hand never letting go even once. At 17, Celeste petitioned for guardianship of her little sister, worked part-time at Walmart, finished her GED at night, raised Brielle on instant noodles and love and the stubborn resolve of a young girl who refused to let the system separate them. Brielle grew up on that sacrifice. She knew every meal on the table was an extra shift her sister worked. Every new book in her backpack was a meal her sister skipped, and she swore to herself that when she grew up she would repay her sister by living a life that mattered. Then Celeste met Ryland Toretti. Brielle didn't know who he was at first, only that her sister was in love with a wealthy man in Scottsdale and moved to live with him in a house Celeste described like a castle. The early calls were long and full of laughter, stories about the baby Zoe on the way. Then they grew shorter, then rarer. Then one day Celeste called and her voice was different, lower, more tired, and she said, "Brie, he doesn't want me contacting family anymore. He says it's safer for me that way. I'm sorry." Brielle asked what safer meant. Celeste fell silent and then said she couldn't explain it. She just wanted Brielle to know she still loved her. That was the last call. After that came silence. Brielle called back dozens of times. The old number disconnected, the new number unanswered. Emails bounced back. Letters sent to the Scottsdale estate returned unopened. She was cut off from her sister, like being cut off from oxygen, and she lived for 2 years not knowing what her niece looked like, not knowing if her sister was happy, knowing nothing at all until the day she opened Google on her old cracked screen phone and found a short line on the Arizona Republic website. The wife of businessman Ryland Toretti has passed away at her residence. Cause of death, suicide. Brielle read that line in the employee break room of the diner, where she worked as a waitress, surrounded by the smell of frying grease and the clatter of plates. And she didn't cry, she didn't breathe. She just sat there with the phone in her hand, and the feeling that someone had drained all the blood from her body in a single second. She wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. She wasn't allowed to see her sister's face one last time. She wasn't allowed to hold Zoe and say Auntie is here. She was allowed nothing except a 17-word headline on a cracked phone screen. From that night on, Brielle lived 2 lives. By day, she carried coffee and pancakes to customers at the diner on Speedway, smiled for tips, said have a good day with empty eyes. By night, she worked a janitorial shift from 10 at night until 4 in the morning in an office building near the University of Arizona, mopping floors, taking out trash, scrubbing toilets, then went home, opened her old laptop, and began her own investigation. She wasn't a detective, wasn't a lawyer, didn't have money to hire anyone, only free Wi-Fi from the cafe downstairs and the stubbornness inherited from her sister. She started with Genevieve Ashford, the woman who appeared in Ryland's life 6 months after Celeste died. She searched social media, public records, archived court pages, and she found the first crack. Genevieve Ashford didn't exist before 2018. No birth record, no school history, no credit trail, nothing. As if she had appeared from nothing. Brielle dug deeper. She found a small article in Portland, Oregon, about a woman named Vivian Hale, who married a real estate developer and then vanished after he died in a household accident. She found a court record in Miami about a woman named Catherine Wells who married a casino owner. The casino went bankrupt. The man died of alcohol poisoning, and Catherine Wells disappeared with his life insurance money. 2 women. 2 cities. 2 wealthy men who died under circumstances ruled accidental or self-inflicted. And when Brielle laid 3 photographs side by side on her bed, Vivian Hale, Catherine Wells, and Genevieve Ashford, she saw the same face staring back at her through 3 different names, the same gray-blue eyes, the same smile just sad enough to seem intriguing. Brielle sat on the sagging bed in her miserable studio at 3 in the morning, and for the first time in 2 years she didn't feel pain anymore. She felt something else, something sharper than pain, colder than pain, clearer than pain. She knew Genevieve had killed her sister, and she knew exactly what she would do next. She knew what she would do next, and it took her 3 months to prepare. Brielle cut her hair to shoulder length, dyed it from blonde to dark brown, different enough that no one would look at her and immediately think of Celeste, but not so different that she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. She used the name Brielle Carter, kept her first name because she was used to responding instinctively when someone called Brielle, but changed her last name because Lawson was a direct thread leading straight back to Celeste, and she couldn't allow that thread to be exposed before the right moment. She knew Torres Estate was looking for a nanny because she had tracked everything related to that house for 2 years, and she knew Genevieve had fired 4 nannies within 12 months, the first after 3 weeks, the second after 6 weeks, the third after 10 days, the fourth in less than a week. The position never stayed filled because no one could tolerate Genevieve long enough, and Brielle bet her entire life on that fact. She applied online through an agency that specialized in domestic staffing for wealthy families in Scottsdale, attaching a fabricated profile that had taken her 2 months to assemble using real childcare courses she had taken in Tucson, a real CPR certification, real first aid credentials, and 3 reference letters from families she had babysat for on the side to earn extra money. The profile was clean enough to pass screening and modest enough not to raise suspicion. 2 weeks later, she received an email scheduling an interview. That morning, Brielle drove her 2009 Honda Civic, with more than 200,000 miles on the odometer from Tucson to Scottsdale. And when the car climbed the hill leading toward Torres Estate, she had to pull over for a moment because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel. The mansion appeared behind the iron gates, like something that didn't belong to the world she lived in. White limestone walls glaring under the morning sun, palm trees standing motionless along the driveway, a granite courtyard so vast her footsteps echoed like she was walking through an empty cathedral. Everything was beautiful. Everything was expensive. Everything was cold. Brielle stepped through the heavy wooden doors and immediately felt the atmosphere inside. Not the chill of air conditioning, but a different kind of cold. The kind without laughter, without the smell of food, without any sign that a 6-year-old child lived there. No toys on the floor, no drawings on the walls, no small shoes by the door. As if the house had swallowed everything belonging to childhood and replaced it with lifeless perfection. Genevieve interviewed her in the first-floor living room, seated on a white leather armchair with her legs crossed and a teacup in her hand, asking each question in a sweet voice, while her gray-blue eyes swept sharply from head to toe over Brielle, as if measuring whether the woman in front of her posed a threat. She asked about experience, about reasons for wanting to be a nanny, about family, and when she asked about family, Brielle delivered the answer she had prepared, her voice flat with just enough sadness. She said she had no family left. Her parents died early. Her sister had passed away as well. Genevieve nodded with a look of feigned sympathy that Brielle recognized immediately, because she had studied enough interviews and social media images of this woman to memorize every expression. Then Genevieve said she would take her upstairs to meet Zoe. They walked to the second floor down a long, oak-lined hallway with abstract paintings on both sides, each piece likely worth an entire year of Brielle's rent, and stopped in front of a white door. Genevieve opened it and called inside in a voice so sweet it sounded false. "Zoe, come say hello to the new nanny." The room was large but bare. A white child's bed, white cabinets, white curtains, sterile in its cleanliness, and in the corner, a 6-year-old girl sat on the floor with a box of colored pencils and a blank sheet of paper. The girl looked up. Brielle stopped breathing. Zoe's blue eyes were Celeste's eyes, not similar, identical, the same ocean blue with gray at the edges, the same slight tilt of the head when looking up, the same naturally long curved lashes Celeste had always been proud of. And when Zoe pressed her lips together and looked at Brielle with cautious fear, Brielle realized that even that tight-lipped expression belonged to Celeste, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek hard to keep from crying on the spot, because she was seeing her sister alive again in a 6-year-old child, curled into the corner of an empty room, as if no one in this house truly belonged to her. Zoe didn't greet her. She only looked at Brielle, then down at the paper, then back at Brielle, and in that look was the same question she had asked the 4 nannies before. "You're going to leave too, aren't you?" Genevieve said Zoe should say hello and not be rude, but Brielle did something none of the previous nannies had done. She didn't stand above her looking down, didn't bend to pat her head, didn't say hello in a fake, sweet adult voice. She sat down on the floor right beside Zoe, said nothing, picked a blue pencil from the box, and began to draw on the blank paper. She drew a house, then a tree, then a smiling sun. Zoe watched Brielle's hand move without speaking. But after a moment she shifted closer, then closer still, then picked up a yellow pencil and drew a flower beside Brielle's tree. Neither of them spoke, but what happened on that sheet of paper was larger than words, and when Brielle glanced over and saw Zoe pressing her lips together in concentration, with an expression identical to Celeste as a child coloring beside her in foster care, Brielle understood that she hadn't come here only to find evidence, not only to avenge her sister, but to protect the last remaining piece of Celeste left in this world, and that piece was sitting beside her on the cold floor, drawing a yellow flower with a tiny hand, and trusting her without yet knowing who she was. The yellow flower on that sheet of paper became the first brick, and in the weeks that followed, Brielle laid down each additional brick, slowly, patiently, without haste, because she understood that the trust of a child who had been abandoned 4 times could not be rebuilt with promises, but only with repeated presence until the child stopped counting down the days until she would disappear. On the first morning, Brielle woke at 5, went down to the kitchen while the entire mansion still slept, and made pancakes. Not ordinary pancakes, but smiley-face pancakes with 2 banana slices for eyes, a curved line of strawberry sauce for a mouth, and a blueberry for a nose. Exactly the recipe Celeste had made for her every Sunday morning when the 2 sisters lived in a small apartment in Tucson, when Celeste was 18, and being both a mother and a sister and never complained once. Brielle set the plate on the kitchen table when Zoe came down, hair messy, eyes heavy with sleep, and the little girl stopped at the doorway staring at the plate as if it were something impossible. She sat, ate slowly, said nothing, but finished every bite, and it was the first morning in a long time that Zoe did not leave food untouched. On the second morning, Brielle cooked again. On the third morning, she did the same. By the 4th morning, Zoe came down earlier than usual and sat waiting in her chair, and Brielle knew the second brick had been set. In the evenings, when Zoe lay in bed and Brielle sat beside her reading, she began to sing. The lullaby Celeste had sung to her every night, an old song without a name that even Celeste could not remember learning, perhaps from their mother, perhaps from their grandmother, perhaps from somewhere even farther back than memory, a simple melody with only a few notes repeating, yet enough to carry a frightened child into sleep. Brielle sang softly, her voice not beautiful but steady, and Zoe lay still listening, eyes open, not asleep but no longer afraid. And near the end of the song she suddenly whispered, "How do you know that song?" Brielle swallowed her tears before answering, swallowed the knot in her throat, and the image of Celeste sitting on a bed singing this same song to her when she was 8 and had just lost her parents. Then she replied in the calmest voice she could manage that someone very special had taught her a long time ago. Zoe did not ask who, did not ask anything else. She simply closed her eyes and slept, but one of her hands held onto Brielle's finger and did not let go all night. The first moment happened in the 2nd week. Brielle was holding Zoe's old stuffed bear and using a deep voice to make it talk, having the bear ask silly questions like, "What day is it today? I am a bear. I cannot count. Who will teach me to count?" And Zoe, the child who had lived in silence for months inside this cold house, laughed. Not a small smile, not a quiet chuckle, but real laughter, clear and bright rising from her belly, the kind of laughter only children have and that appears only when a child feels safe enough to forget fear. Brielle heard that laughter and had to turn her face away for a second, because it sounded so much like Celeste that she felt as if her sister were in the room. The second moment came in the 3rd week. One morning, Brielle opened Zoe's bedroom door as usual, and instead of finding the girl curled on the bed waiting with guarded eyes like in the early weeks, she saw Zoe jump down and run straight into her, wrapping her arms around Brielle's waist, pressing her face into Brielle's stomach, and saying, "Morning, Miss Brie." Those 2 words were short and ordinary, yet it was the first time Zoe had reached out to someone not out of fear but out of desire, and Brielle stood there holding the niece who did not know she was her niece, feeling the small arms tighten around her waist, and she thought this was the reason she was still alive. The 3rd moment arrived in the 5th week. Brielle was tidying Zoe's room when she noticed a new drawing on the desk. In the previous weeks, Zoe had drawn only one figure, a little girl standing alone in the middle of a vast white page. No house, no tree, no one else. But today's drawing had 3 people. The tallest wore black, that was Daddy. The smallest wore a white dress, that was Zoe, and between them stood a figure holding both their hands, brown hair, smiling, with messy letters written beside it that read Miss Brie. Brielle picked up the drawing, and this time she could not hold back. Tears fell onto the paper, landing directly on the crayon-colored hand of the figure in the middle, and she pressed the drawing to her chest, as if holding a love letter written in colored wax from the only child in the world she would willingly die for, the child Celeste had given birth to, and whom she had sworn to protect at any cost. Even if it meant using a false name, a false life, becoming someone else entirely, just to stand here in this cold white room holding a drawing of 3 people and knowing that she had not arrived too late. Ryland Toretti trusted no one. That was the first rule his father taught him, before his father was shot dead in the parking lot of an Italian restaurant in South Phoenix, when Ryland was 17, and that rule had kept him alive until 36. He didn't trust partners, didn't trust the police, didn't trust friends, and especially didn't trust anyone who entered his home without being thoroughly vetted. So when Brielle Carter appeared and Zoe began to change, his first reaction was not gratitude but suspicion. He noticed every small detail. Zoe finished her breakfast, instead of leaving it half-eaten. Zoe slept through the night instead of waking up crying at 3 in the morning. Zoe spoke more, laughed more, ran faster down the hallways instead of keeping close to the walls as if afraid of taking up too much space. The changes were obvious and positive, but to a man accustomed to a world where every good thing came with a price, the question wasn't why the child was happier, but what this woman wanted. He checked the way he knew best, through cameras. Toretti Estate had 46 security cameras covering every corner of the house, every hallway, every entrance, and Ryland had a habit of reviewing the footage every night before sleeping on the laptop in his study, not because he feared enemies outside, but because he had lived long enough to know the most dangerous enemy was always inside. The first night he reviewed Brielle's footage, he saw ordinary things. She fed Zoe, read stories, cleaned the room. The second night was the same. By the 5th night, he saw something that made him stop and rewind. At 2:17 in the morning, the camera in Zoe's room recorded the child jolting awake crying, her hands flailing in the dark, her mouth calling Daddy while no one came, because Ryland was downstairs in his study and didn't hear. But 30 seconds later the door opened, and Brielle stepped in, wearing old sleepwear, hair messy, eyes heavy with sleep, yet her steps quick, as if she had been sleeping with one ear tuned to Zoe all along. She sat on the floor beside the bed, didn't turn on the light, pulled Zoe into her arms, wrapped both arms around her, and stayed there without moving, for 47 minutes, until Zoe fell asleep again. Ryland watched that footage on his laptop screen, and didn't know what he felt, only that something in his chest had grown heavier than before, and it wasn't suspicion. The first moment happened on a Thursday night. Ryland came home close to 1 in the morning after a long meeting in Phoenix, walked into the kitchen in the dark to get water, and saw Brielle standing at the stove, warming milk for Zoe. She hadn't turned on the kitchen lights. Only the pale blue glow from the open refrigerator cast a small pool of light, and in that light Brielle stood with brown hair falling over her shoulders, hands stirring milk in a small pot, eyes lowered, and she looked as if she belonged in that kitchen, belonged in that house, in a way Ryland couldn't explain. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, the two of them facing each other in the dark. No words spoken, none needed. The distance between them only 3 steps, yet the space intimate enough that both felt it, the kind of intimacy no one planned. That happens naturally when 2 people stand in a dark kitchen at 1 in the morning for the same reason, caring about the same child. Brielle spoke softly that Zoe had a nightmare, and she was making warm milk. Ryland nodded. The session stretched longer than necessary. Ryland left first, unaware that when he turned his back, Brielle closed her eyes and exhaled as if she had been holding her breath too long. The second moment came another night, this time from Brielle's side. She passed Ryland's study near midnight on her way to the kitchen for water, and saw the door ajar, the yellow desk lamp casting a thin strip of light across the hallway floor. She hadn't intended to look in, but her feet stopped before her mind could tell them to move on. Through the crack in the door, she saw Ryland sitting in the leather chair behind his desk, one hand supporting his forehead, eyes red, and on the desk in front of him a silver frame. Inside the frame was a face Brielle recognized instantly, even from a distance, through the narrow opening. Celeste, her sister, smiling in the photograph, blonde hair, blue eyes, forever 34 in the silver frame on the desk of the man who hadn't protected her. Ryland wasn't crying out loud. He simply sat there with his hand to his forehead and his shoulders trembling slightly. The tremor of a man trying to keep everything inside because he didn't know how to let it out, and Brielle stood in the hallway watching through the crack, and felt something shift inside her chest, something she didn't want to feel and wasn't allowed to feel, because the man in that room was her sister's husband, the man who had cut her off from Celeste, the Mafia boss, the target, not someone she was allowed to look at that way. But that night she lay awake on the small bed in the nanny's room, unable to sleep, because she realized a truth she didn't want to admit, that Ryland Toretti, the man half of Arizona feared, was also carrying a pain he hid from the world, and that pain had the same name as hers. Celeste. From that night on, they both began to look at each other differently. Not much, not clearly, just eyes lingering half a second longer when they met in the hallway, voices dropping slightly when they spoke about Zoe as if sharing something more private than caring for a child. But neither acknowledged it, neither spoke it aloud, because they both knew that whatever was forming between them was more dangerous than anything outside these walls. And if it shattered, no one would come away whole. Genevieve wasn't stupid. She wasn't stupid when she deceived 3 wealthy men in 3 different cities. And she wasn't stupid when she realized that what was changing in this house wasn't Zoe, but the way Ryland looked at the nanny. She saw it in the small details that only a jealous woman knows how to read. Ryland asked about Zoe more often when he came home, but the question always began with what did Brielle say? Ryland paused longer at Zoe's bedroom door each night than before, yet his eyes weren't on Zoe but on the young woman sitting beside the bed reading a story. And Ryland no longer called Brielle by her last name. He called her simply Brielle, 2 syllables leaving his mouth softer than any name he had ever spoken. Genevieve didn't need anyone to explain it to her to understand that she was losing control. And for someone who had built her entire life on control, losing control was the same as losing her life, only slower. She started with small things. One afternoon, Brielle returned from the grocery store to find her room had been searched. Drawers left ajar, clothes folded back incorrectly, the old laptop shifted a couple of inches from where she had left it, and the notebook she used for her investigation tucked at the bottom of her suitcase, instead of in the jacket pocket where she always hid it. Brielle said nothing, only checked quickly and confirmed that the notebook was written in a private code she had invented, so no one could understand it even if they read it. But her heart beat faster, because she knew Genevieve was looking for a reason to get rid of her. The following week, an expensive ceramic bowl from the kitchen cabinet shattered, and Genevieve told Ryland in a sweet, concerned voice that she had seen Brielle washing dishes a bit carelessly, that she didn't want to speak badly of anyone, but the set was something she had bought in Italy, and she just wanted him to know. Then Zoe's favorite toy disappeared, a small stuffed rabbit the child slept with every night, and Genevieve said perhaps Brielle had thrown it away by mistake while cleaning, her tone not accusatory but worse, sympathetic, the kind of sympathy that said, I don't blame her, but maybe she isn't careful enough for this job. Each time Genevieve spoke, Ryland listened without reacting, and Brielle didn't know whether he believed her or not, but she didn't dare argue, because arguing meant drawing attention, and attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant her real identity could be exposed. But what Genevieve did to Brielle was only a power game between adults. What she did to Zoe was what made Brielle grind her teeth. When no one was watching, when Ryland was at work and Brielle was on another floor, Genevieve treated Zoe with a cruelty that left no marks, cruelty with words and control rather than hands. She spoke to Zoe in a low, cold voice, telling her that no one really wanted to stay here with her, that the nannies took Daddy's money and left, that she shouldn't cling. She locked Zoe inside the dark walk-in closet on the 3rd floor whenever the child cried or asked for Brielle, shut the door, and told her to sit there quietly until she learned to obey. And the cruelest move, the one Brielle didn't discover for 2 weeks, Genevieve threatened Zoe that if she told anyone anything, then Daddy would send Miss Bry away, and she would never see her again. Zoe believed her. The 6-year-old believed that silence was the only way to keep Brielle there, and she endured everything without saying a word. Not to Brielle, not to Ryland, not to anyone, because in the child's mind the calculation was simple. Pain could be endured, but losing Miss Bry couldn't. Brielle realized it gradually. She noticed when Zoe flinched every time she heard Genevieve's heels clicking down the hallway. She noticed when Zoe always checked whether the closet door was open before entering her room. She noticed when one night Zoe spoke in her sleep, saying she was good now. Please don't lock me in. I won't tell anyone. Brielle lay in her room, listening to that sleep talk through the thin wall, and bit into her pillow to keep from screaming, because the anger inside her then wasn't the kind that exploded, but the kind that froze into something sharper than a blade. Yet she couldn't act. Not yet, because she didn't have enough proof to trade for justice. And if she accused now with emotion instead of facts, Genevieve would turn it around, would play the victim, would cry beautifully, and Brielle would be thrown out and lose Zoe forever, the same way she had lost Celeste. So she swallowed the anger, swallowed it deep, kept it in the safest place inside her, and continued to be the obedient nanny, continued to smile at Genevieve, continued to wait, because Brielle Lawson had waited 2 years to get inside this house, and she was willing to wait longer if needed. But when she finally moved, it would be once, and Genevieve wouldn't get another chance to perform. That day, Genevieve sent Brielle out to shop at Kierland Commons, with an absurdly long list that included scented candles from one store, organic towels from another, a specific tea available only at a small shop on the east corner of the complex, a list designed to take at least 30 minutes going and 30 minutes returning, not counting the shopping itself. As if Genevieve had deliberately planned for Brielle to be gone as long as possible. Brielle drove off with the list on the passenger seat, but less than 10 minutes after turning onto Scottsdale Road, something tightened deep in her stomach. Not pain, not hunger, but something she couldn't explain with reason. The feeling of wrongness, the feeling that something was happening and she should not be absent. The same kind of feeling Celeste used to call a gut feeling and say, "Never ignore it, Brie, because your stomach knows before your head does." Brielle turned the car around. She didn't call, didn't text. She simply made a U-turn at the intersection and pressed the gas back toward Toretti Estate, her heart beating faster with every mile. When she drove through the iron gates that were still open, she saw the black Maybach parked in the middle of the courtyard, the driver door wide open, the engine still running, and on the lawn beside the desert flower beds, Ryland Toretti lay on the ground holding Zoe against his chest. Brielle slammed the brakes so hard the tires screeched across the granite. She jumped out without turning off the engine, ran across the courtyard, and when she got close enough to see clearly, her legs nearly gave way. Blood on Ryland's hands, cactus spines embedded in the back of his suit jacket, red dirt everywhere, and Zoe curled into his chest, trembling, eyes shut, fingers clutching his shirt as if letting go meant death. Brielle dropped to her knees and did the one thing she couldn't control. She wrapped Zoe from the other side, both arms around the child's back, face buried in her niece's hair, and she cried. Not quiet tears, but uncontrolled sobbing, the kind that rises from deep in the body and breaks out as sound before you can stop it. Because when she saw Zoe shaking in her father's arms after falling from the 4th floor, there was only one image in her mind: Celeste lying in the bathtub, eyes closed, blonde hair floating on the water, and she understood that her sister may have died the same way, not by her own hand but by the hand of the same woman, and Zoe had almost followed her mother because Brielle had not been here to stop it. Ryland watched Brielle cry, and for the first time he saw something that didn't fit. A caring nanny would worry, would ask questions, would call for an ambulance, but she wouldn't cry like this. Not this shattered from the inside kind of crying, the crying of someone who had almost lost something of her own flesh and blood. And in his mind, a question began to form, though he didn't ask it yet, because at that moment, Zoe mattered more than any question. At the hospital, Brielle sat outside the emergency room on a green plastic chair under fluorescent lights, her hands clenched tightly on her thighs, knuckles white, and she heard everything from behind the curtain, without anyone knowing she heard. She heard the doctor talk about a hand-shaped bruise, heard about mandatory reporting, heard Ryland's silence like the stillness before a storm, and every word she heard was another bullet fired into her chest, because she knew whose hand it was, but she couldn't say it yet. Then Genevieve arrived. Brielle heard the heels before she saw the woman, the steady clicking on the hospital floor she had memorized after weeks in the same house. And when Genevieve rounded the corner with fake red eyes and her hand covering her face, Brielle saw it. On Genevieve's left wrist, just beneath the lifted sleeve, was a thin silver bracelet. Brielle knew that bracelet. She knew it because she had held it 19 years earlier, when Celeste was 17, and bought it with her first paycheck from Walmart, a cheap silver bracelet engraved with the initials CL for Celeste Lawson, and gave it to Brielle on her 8th birthday, telling her that whenever she missed her sister she should look at the bracelet. Brielle wore it for 5 years, and then gave it back to Celeste on her wedding day, saying, "You take it because now you need to remember me more than I need to remember you." And Celeste had cried and put it on, and never took it off again. That bracelet should have been in Celeste's jewelry box, or buried with her in her coffin, or anywhere except on the wrist of the woman walking into the hospital with false tears. Brielle felt the hallway tilt, the fluorescent lights blur, the floor sway beneath her feet, and she reached out to brace herself against the wall to keep from collapsing as her entire body tried to give in. She bit her lip until it bled to stay silent, pressed her back against the cold wall to stay upright, and watched Genevieve pass by without looking at her, walking straight into Zoe's room to continue playing the role of the loving stepmother, with Brielle's sister's bracelet glinting on her wrist under the hospital lights. When Genevieve disappeared behind the curtain, Brielle stood alone in the hallway, and for the first time since she began her investigation, she no longer believed. She knew. She knew Genevieve was involved in Celeste's death, not as suspicion, not as theory, but as certainty, carried by the cheap silver bracelet engraved with the initials CL that no one else in this world would ever wear, now sitting on the killer's wrist like a trophy. After that night, Ryland called the only person he trusted besides himself. Donovan Kessler answered after 2 rings, and didn't ask why the call came at 3 in the morning, because 20 years of working with Ryland had taught him that when Ryland called at 3 in the morning, no one asked why. They only asked what was needed. Ryland spoke briefly that he needed Donovan to tear apart everything about Genevieve Ashford from the day she was born to the minute she stepped into his house, that he wanted to know everything and he wanted it fast. Donovan didn't ask for reasons and only said to give him 48 hours. Donovan Kessler was 45 years old, a former DEA agent who had gone undercover for 14 months inside a cartel in Nogales before leaving federal service and becoming Ryland's right hand, not for money, but because Ryland was the only man who pulled him out of the bottom of a whiskey bottle after his wife died of cancer, and the DEA refused to grant him enough leave to stay with her in her final days. Donovan never forgot that debt, and when Ryland needed him, he used everything he had: a network of former colleagues in the DEA, the FBI, the United States Marshals, people who still owed him favors from his undercover years, people willing to open federal databases in the middle of the night if Donovan called with the right tone. 48 hours later, Donovan sat in Ryland's study, holding a USB drive with the face of a man who had just seen something that made him want to shower. Genevieve Ashford didn't exist before 2018, he said flatly, like reading a report. Before that, she was Catherine Wells in Miami, Florida. Before that, she was Vivian Hale in Portland, Oregon. There might be more names, but I haven't traced them all yet. Donovan opened his laptop and went through the files. Portland. Vivian Hale married a real estate developer named Gregory Dunn. 10 months later, he died after falling down the stairs in his home near midnight. The coroner ruled it an accident. Vivian inherited $1,800,000 in life insurance and disappeared within 2 weeks. Miami. Catherine Wells married a casino owner named Albert Fonseca. 8 months later, the casino went bankrupt after a series of disastrous investment decisions that later investigations showed signs of internal manipulation. Fonseca died of methanol alcohol poisoning 3 months after the bankruptcy. Catherine disappeared with the insurance payout and offshore accounts that Fonseca had transferred into her name before his death. 2 men, 2 cities. 2 deaths ruled accidental, the same face under 3 different names. Ryland listened and said nothing for a long minute, his face frozen in the expression Donovan knew was the most dangerous of all: absolute calm. That same night downstairs, Brielle was conducting her own investigation. She waited until the clock read 2 in the morning, when Genevieve had taken her usual sleeping pill and Ryland was still in his study. Then she slipped down to the basement via the staff staircase. The basement of Torretti Estate was as large as the entire first floor, with a vast wine cellar holding thousands of bottles, a recreation room, a screening room, but Brielle wasn't there for any of that. She was there for a detail she had noticed 2 weeks earlier while cleaning: a scratch on the wooden floor behind the last wine rack, a curved arc like the rack had been swung open and shut many times. She pushed the rack and it slid left more easily than she expected, revealing a wooden panel behind it with a small electronic lock. Brielle tried the 4-digit code Genevieve used for everything, the last 4 numbers of her phone, and the panel opened. Behind it was a small windowless room with lights that turned on automatically when the door opened, a deadbolt on the outside of the door, meaning the room was designed to lock someone inside rather than protect someone inside. A small camera mounted on the ceiling connected to a private system separate from Ryland's 46 security cameras, and a small wall safe that also used 4 digits, and opened with the same code. Brielle opened the safe and found 3 United States passports with 3 different names: Vivian Hale, Catherine Wells, Genevieve Ashford, all bearing the same face. A thick bundle of cash, made entirely of $100 bills, and a burner phone still charged. Brielle photographed everything with her phone, her hands shaking so badly the first 3 shots were blurred and had to be retaken. Then she closed the safe, closed the panel, pushed the wine rack back into place, and climbed the stairs with her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She had just stepped into the first-floor hallway when she froze. Donovan Kessler stood in the shadows at the end of the hall, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 14 months undercover in a cartel and knew exactly when someone was hiding something. Silence stretched for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then Donovan spoke in a low voice without a trace of surprise and said that she wasn't Brielle Carter. Brielle didn't answer. Donovan continued that he had checked her file from the day she entered the house. Brielle Carter didn't exist before 2 years ago, exactly the same way Genevieve Ashford didn't exist before 2018. But there was one difference. Genevieve hid her identity because she was running from something, while Brielle hid hers because she was looking for someone. "I know who you are. You are Celeste Lawson's sister." Brielle felt the floor tilt for the second time that day, but this time she didn't grab the wall. She stood straight, met Donovan's eyes, and didn't deny it. Donovan led her up to the study where Ryland was waiting. Ryland stood behind the desk, the warm yellow desk lamp lighting half his face while the other half remained in shadow. And he looked at Brielle with an expression she had never seen him give anyone. Not anger, not disappointment, but the look of a man who had just been betrayed by something he never expected. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Brielle stood in the center of the room, knowing that if she told the full truth at that moment, everything would change, and she could lose Zoe that very night. But she also knew that if she kept lying to the man in front of her, she would be no different from Genevieve. She didn't say her real name yet, but she said the truest thing she had. She said that she had lost the most important person in her life, and she wouldn't let that happen to Zoe. Ryland looked at her for a long moment, a silence heavier than any words, then stepped closer until Brielle could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the pulse beating at his temple, and he spoke each word slowly and clearly, that if she hid anything from him related to his daughter's safety, he wouldn't forgive her. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, and Brielle nodded because she knew he meant it, and she knew the time for hiding was almost over. The time for hiding ended the next morning. Donovan knocked on Brielle's door at 6 in the morning, before Genevieve woke, before Zoe woke, and said only one sentence that Ryland wanted to see her now. Brielle followed Donovan down to Ryland's study without asking anything, because she knew that the night before had been the last night she could still be Brielle Carter. Ryland stood behind the desk, not sitting, both hands braced against the wood, and when Brielle entered he did not invite her to sit, did not greet her, only looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent the entire night awake with a bottle of whiskey and a USB drive filled with the truth about his wife. Donovan closed the door and leaned against the wall in silence, his role a witness and not a referee. Ryland said that Donovan had told him she was not Brielle Carter, and that he was giving her one single chance to tell the truth, that if she lied one more time she would be out of the house in 10 minutes and would never see Zoe again. Brielle took a long breath and told the truth. She said her real name was Brielle Lawson. She said she was Celeste's sister. She spoke about the accident on Interstate 10, about Celeste raising her, about being cut off when Celeste married Ryland, about the 17-word notice on the Arizona Republic announcing her sister's death, about 2 years living alone in a miserable studio in Tucson and investigating by herself. She opened her phone and handed it to Ryland. The photos of the basement, the safe, the 3 passports with 3 different names and 1 face, the photo of the silver bracelet engraved with the letters CL on Genevieve's wrist. She said she had come to find proof that Genevieve killed her sister, to protect Zoe, and to take revenge. She spoke without shaking, without crying, without asking for mercy, because Brielle Lawson had waited 2 years for this moment, and she would not let tears weaken the truth. Ryland listened, and then he became angry. Not the cold anger he had given Genevieve at the hospital, but hot anger, real anger, the anger of a man betrayed by something he had never guarded against. He said she had deceived him, that she had infiltrated his house, used a false name, approached his daughter with lies, exploited the trust of a 6-year-old child. Brielle did not argue because everything he said was true. He continued that the child called her Miss Bree, that the child hugged her every morning, that the child drew her in pictures, and that she had come to the child with deception. That sentence hurt more than anything because it was the truest. Brielle swallowed and said only one sentence, that everything she gave Zoe was real, that her name was false, but the love she gave her niece was not false for a single second. The words "my niece" hung in the air. Ryland stopped. Donovan did not move. Then Ryland looked down at the phone on the desk, at the photos of the 3 passports, at the photo of the bracelet engraved CL that he recognized because Celeste had worn it every day throughout their time together, and his anger shifted direction like a current changing course. He was not less angry at Brielle, but he began to be far more angry at something else, at himself. He realized he had married someone capable of killing Celeste. He realized the bracelet his wife wore every day now sat on the wrist of her killer like a trophy. He realized that 2 years earlier, he had made 3 phone calls to close the investigation into Celeste's death, that he had chosen to protect the Empire instead of seeking the truth. And that decision had not only betrayed Celeste, but had opened the door for her killer to enter his home and almost kill her daughter as well. Ryland placed his hands on the desk, lowered his head, and remained silent for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was firm. "From now on, you stay in this house, but you follow my lead. And if you act alone one more time, then no matter who you are, I will treat you like an enemy." Brielle nodded. It was not forgiveness, only a temporary pact between 2 people with a shared enemy. But no one in that room knew that Genevieve had woken earlier than they thought. She did not hear the conversation, but she saw Brielle follow Donovan into Ryland's study at 6 in the morning. And the instincts of someone who had lived by deception her entire life told her that when 3 people met behind closed doors at 6 in the morning, the subject of that meeting was her. Genevieve did not panic. She never panicked. She simply shifted into survival mode. She retrieved a spare burner phone hidden in the lining of her shoe in the closet and called Frankie Malone, a man she had hired back in Miami, someone who did dirty work without asking why. She told Frankie she needed eyes on the nanny, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where she went, what she did, who she met. She wanted to know everything. 2 days later, Frankie sent Genevieve a photo taken with a long lens. Brielle and Zoe sitting on a swing at McCormick-Stillman Railroad Park, Zoe laughing, Brielle pushing the swing, golden afternoon light, the 2 of them looking as if they belonged together. Attached was a short message from Frankie saying, "Done." Genevieve looked at the photo and sent back a single line saying, "Careful now." She did not send it to Frankie. She sent it to Brielle from an unknown number. Brielle received the message at 10 at night while sitting beside Zoe's bed, looking at the photo of herself and Zoe taken from afar, and she understood that the game had moved into a new phase. That same night, Genevieve called Harlan Prescott, a 55-year-old attorney who specialized in defending the elite of Phoenix, the man who had helped her escape a civil lawsuit in Miami without anyone knowing. Genevieve spoke plainly that if Ryland touched her, she would hand everything she knew about the Toretti Empire to the FBI, the transport routes, the list of partners, the offshore accounts, all of it, and that he would die in federal prison. Harlan asked what she wanted. Genevieve said money, freedom, and a new identity. After a brief silence, she added that if they did not give her those things, then she would drag everything down with her, because she had nothing left to lose, but Ryland Toretti did. He had a daughter, and that was the most dangerous weapon in the world. Not guns, not money, but the thing people are most afraid to lose. Genevieve didn't wait. She never waited, because waiting was a privilege for people who still had something to lose. And Genevieve had lived her entire life by one simple rule. When a door was about to close, you ran before it shut, and if necessary, you dragged along whatever was most valuable to use as a hostage. That morning, Brielle left the house at 9 o'clock to meet Donovan at a cafe on Camelback Road, according to the plan Ryland had arranged. The purpose was to cross-check evidence and prepare a file for the attorney, and Brielle went reluctantly because she didn't want to leave Zoe. But Ryland said he would stay home, and Donovan needed her to confirm several basement details that only she knew. Genevieve watched Brielle drive out through the gate from the 2nd-floor window, and waited exactly 15 minutes, just long enough for the old Honda Civic to disappear completely onto Scottsdale Road. Then she acted. She went up to Zoe's room where the child was sitting on the floor drawing, opened the door, and said in the sweet voice Zoe had learned to fear, "Come with Mommy, I'm taking you out to have fun." Zoe didn't move. She looked up with blue eyes like Celeste's, and shook her head, not speaking, just shaking it, because 6 years old was old enough to know when sweetness was a trap. Genevieve had no time for resistance. She grabbed Zoe's wrist and pulled her to her feet. Zoe cried out in pain and tried to pull free, but Genevieve was stronger and dragged her down the back service stairs, the stairs used by staff, the stairs without cameras because Ryland never thought an enemy would use the servants' way. Zoe began to cry, Not loudly because Genevieve had taught her that crying out loud meant punishment, so she cried quietly, the kind of crying swallowed inward where only trembling shoulders and silent tears sliding down her cheeks betrayed it. The back door opened onto a black SUV already waiting. Frankie Malone behind the wheel wearing sunglasses, his face blank. The face of someone who had done dirty work too many times to feel anything anymore. Genevieve shoved Zoe into the back seat. Zoe kicked and struggled, calling Daddy, calling Miss Bree. But Genevieve pressed her down and said in a voice that sounded sweet on the surface, but was steel underneath. Mommy's taking you on a trip, sweetie. Sit still now. Everything will be fine. Frankie pulled the vehicle out through the west service gate, the gate used for food deliveries. The gate without a guard, because Genevieve had arranged for the guard assigned there to take the day off with an envelope of cash left on his desk the night before. The SUV hit the road and vanished into traffic on Frank Lloyd Wright Boulevard in less than 3 minutes. Ryland discovered Zoe was gone at 9:45 when he went up to her room after a work call ended early. The room was empty. Colored pencils lay scattered on the floor. A half-finished drawing sat on the desk. Zoe's shoes were still on the rack, but her everyday sandals were gone. He called her name and got no answer. He called louder. His voice echoing down the empty hallway, answered only by silence. He checked the cameras and saw that all cameras in the house were functioning normally, except the back service stairs, which showed nothing, because Genevieve had disabled them the night before, using the remote for the separate camera system she had installed in the basement. Ryland understood in 3 seconds. 3 seconds were all he needed to move from shock to absolute calm, the kind of calm a mafia boss had when war began, and emotion became a luxury that couldn't exist. He called Donovan first, his voice flat like reading a phone number. Zoe's gone. Genevieve took her. Find her now. Then he made more calls, and within 10 minutes the entire Toretti network was fully awake. Every operative in Phoenix, Scottsdale, Tempe, Mesa was activated. 2 contacts inside Scottsdale Police Department began sweeping traffic cameras on every major route out of the city. One of Ryland's private technicians hacked into the Arizona Department of Transportation traffic camera system within 15 minutes. Genevieve's phone was traced but already powered off. Frankie Malone's phone was traced, and last pinged somewhere on Interstate 10, heading toward Phoenix. Ryland stood in the middle of the villa's living room with the phone pressed to his ear, staring out the window without blinking. And in that moment, he was no longer a father. He was Ryland Toretti, the man half of Arizona feared, and he would use everything that half of Arizona feared to find his daughter, even if he had to turn over every stone in the Sonoran Desert. Brielle arrived home 12 minutes after Donovan's call. She jumped out of the car before it fully stopped, ran through the front door, and the instant she saw Ryland standing in the living room, with a look she had never seen on his face, she knew before he spoke. Zoe. Brielle felt all the blood drain to her legs and the edges of the world blur, but she didn't faint because she wasn't allowed to faint, because Zoe was out there, and every second she stood here was another second the child was farther away. She walked up to Ryland, and for the first time since entering this house, she hid nothing, calculated nothing, played no role. She was just Brielle Lawson, a 27-year-old woman who had lost her parents, lost her sister, and was now losing the last niece she had in the world. And she looked into Ryland's eyes with tears streaming and said in a voice that broke halfway through, "That's my niece. Please find her." The first 4 words were the truth she had hidden for months. The last 2 were a plea she had never made to anyone, because Brielle Lawson hadn't begged for anything since the day Celeste taught her to stand on her own 2 feet. But today she begged, because Zoe was worth her laying everything down. Pride, plans, vengeance. Ryland looked at her, and in that moment every wall between them collapsed. Not slowly, not brick by brick, but all at once like a building brought down. Because in that sentence, Ryland didn't hear a nanny, didn't hear an infiltrator, didn't hear a stranger. He heard an aunt losing her child. He heard blood calling to blood. And he heard the one thing he, a mafia boss who lived on suspicion, had searched for in Brielle from the first day, and hadn't found until now. Truth without calculation. He said briefly, his voice not soft but not cold. "I will find her, and when I do, you and I will talk for real." Then he turned away, picked up his phone, and became the thing Genevieve should have feared from the beginning but had been too arrogant to fear, a mafia boss looking for his child. Donovan found them in 2 hours and 7 minutes. The final ping from Frankie Malone's phone led to an abandoned industrial zone near South Mountain, south of Phoenix, where old warehouses from the early 2000s construction boom stood motionless under the desert sun like concrete corpses, rusted metal doors, parking lots overrun with weeds and plastic bottles, the kind of place no one went unless they wanted to hide something or hide someone. Donovan confirmed the black SUV parked along the side of warehouse number 7 through a small drone camera he launched from his vehicle, half a mile away, and he called Ryland in a voice clipped like code. South Mountain Industrial, Warehouse 7, 1 vehicle, 2 adults, 1 child, Frankie's armed. Ryland arrived in 14 minutes, blowing past every speed limit on Interstate 10 without caring, because his network had already ensured no police unit on that stretch would stop the black Maybach for the next hour. He parked 100 meters from the warehouse and stepped out, dressed in black. No suit, no tie, just a rolled-sleeve shirt and Oxford shoes. He didn't bother changing, because there was no time for anything except his daughter. Donovan moved beside him, handgun holstered under his jacket, eyes scanning the area with the habit of a man who had survived 14 months inside a cartel. The warehouse door wasn't locked, only held shut by a metal bar, and when Ryland pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowed the desert light like a black hole. The smell of dust, old machine oil, damp concrete, and fear hit him at once, a smell Ryland had encountered too many times to mistake, the smell of a place where people were held against their will. Inside, the space was vast and high-ceilinged, light slipping through a few gaps in the tin roof, casting slanted beams across the darkness like blades. Frankie Malone stood in the middle of the warehouse, heard the door, turned, his hand going for the gun at his waist. He didn't get the chance to raise it. Donovan moved faster, cleaner, more precise, 2 steps forward, one hand knocking the gun aside, one knee driving into Frankie's stomach, Frankie folding as Donovan twisted him face down onto the concrete and bound his wrists behind his back in under 4 seconds. No gunshots, no wasted words, just Frankie's labored breathing and the hiss of zip ties tightening. Ryland didn't look at Frankie. He looked past him into the deepest part of the warehouse where the light didn't reach, and there he saw her. Zoe sat curled in a corner on the cold concrete floor, clutching a small pillow someone had tossed to her like a bone to a dog, knees pulled to her chest, face buried, hair matted, and when Ryland stepped closer, he saw her small shoulders shaking, steady rhythmic shaking, the kind that came after tears were already spent, and the body no longer knew how to stop. Ryland knelt 1 step away, didn't rush her, didn't grab her, because he knew a child who had just been kidnapped would fear any sudden movement, even from someone she loved. He spoke softly, the lowest his voice could go. "Zoe, Daddy's here. You're safe now." Zoe looked up, blue eyes red-rimmed, cheeks dirty, lips cracked, and for a second she stared at him like she didn't believe it, like she'd been calling Daddy in her head for 2 hours with no answer. And now she wasn't sure if this was real, or another dream that would vanish when she blinked. Then she knew it was real. Zoe launched herself into Ryland, arms locked around his neck, face pressed into his shoulder, and the sob broke free. Not the swallowed, quiet crying Genevieve had taught her, but real crying, loud and unrestrained, because Daddy had come and Daddy was the only safe place in the world. Then she spoke between sobs, and what she said wasn't "Daddy, I was scared," or "Daddy, take me home." It was "Daddy, where's Miss Bree? I want Miss Bree." Ryland held her tighter and said, "She's waiting for you. Daddy's taking you back to Bry right now." He stood, Zoe in his arms, and looked toward the far wall where Genevieve stood motionless, back against concrete, arms hanging loose, not running, not performing, not crying. For the first time since Ryland had known her, Genevieve wore no mask. Her face was empty, cold, like stagnant water, and in the weak light filtering through the roof, Ryland finally saw what he should have seen 2 years earlier. There was nothing behind those gray-blue eyes, no love, no hatred, no remorse, nothing at all, just the emptiness of someone who had learned to imitate emotion without ever feeling it. Ryland looked at her and spoke without shouting, his voice flat as a tabletop. "You're done." 2 words, no more were needed, no explanation required, because to Ryland Toretti those 2 words weighed more than a death sentence. And Genevieve was smart enough to understand that her life as she knew it ended in that warehouse. Donovan stayed behind to handle Frankie and hold Genevieve until Ryland's people arrived, and Ryland drove to the penthouse in Old Town Scottsdale, the safe apartment he'd moved Brielle into that morning because Toretti Estate was no longer secure. He drove one-handed, the other holding Zoe on his lap, and she didn't speak the entire way back, just leaned against his chest, gripping his shirt. But she wasn't shaking anymore. and that was enough. When the elevator opened onto the penthouse floor, Brielle stood directly in front of it. She'd been there since Ryland called to say he'd found Zoe, standing still, not sitting, not pacing, not really breathing, just waiting, her whole body trembling from head to toe, the kind of shaking that came when adrenaline had been held too long and finally drained away. Zoe saw Brielle and twisted out of Ryland's arms. She ran, small feet pounding on the wood floor, and threw herself into Brielle with the full force of a 6-year-old finding her way home. Brielle dropped to her knees to catch her, arms wrapping Zoe to her chest, face buried in the child's hair, and she cried. No sound, no sobs, just tears streaming silently down her face into Zoe's hair. The kind of crying that came when someone had almost lost the thing they loved most, and now held it, and couldn't believe they were allowed to keep it. Zoe spoke into Brielle's shoulder, her voice small and hoarse from too much crying. "Don't leave me, Miss Brie. Promise me." Brielle tightened her hold, her voice breaking but firm. "I promise. I'm never leaving you." Ryland stood behind them, leaning against the elevator frame, watching the two of them on the penthouse floor. He watched the way Brielle held Zoe, holding her with her whole body like a wall built around her. And he watched the way Zoe clung to Brielle, all 10 fingers gripping like this, was the person she trusted most in the world. Even more than him. And in that moment, Ryland understood something he should have understood long ago. Brielle wasn't a nanny, wasn't an intruder, wasn't a stranger. She was Zoe's real family, blood and flesh, the last remaining piece of Celeste. And she hadn't come here for vengeance but for love, the same kind of love Celeste had used to raise her from ashes. And now Brielle was using it to keep Celeste's daughter from being lost to another pile of ashes. Ryland hired Paige Whitmore, because in Arizona's legal circles, there was only one person brave enough to take a case involving the Torres family without her hands shaking. And that person was Paige, 40 years old, black hair cut to shoulder length, rarely smiling, sharp-eyed, a specialist in children's rights who had pulled children out of powerful families the justice system itself was afraid to touch. And when Donovan called her with the exact words, "There is a 6-year-old who needs you," she didn't ask who the father was, didn't ask how much the fee would be. She only asked where the evidence was. The evidence was assembled over 2 weeks, Paige working every night at the penthouse with Donovan and Brielle, fitting each piece into the file with the precision of someone who knew that in court there was only one chance, and if a single piece was missing, the other side would slip through the gap like a snake. There was the medical report from Dr. Catherine Reyes, with photographs of the hand-shaped bruise on Zoe's back. There were records of Genevieve's 3 false identities traced by Donovan through federal networks. There were photographs of the hidden basement, the concealed panel, the deadbolt locked from the outside, the private camera system, the safe containing forged passports, taken by Brielle herself. There was the photograph of the silver bracelet engraved with the initials CL on Genevieve's wrist, an item that belonged to Celeste Lawson. And there was the heaviest evidence of all, the recorded phone call between Genevieve and Frankie Malone that Donovan intercepted from the burner phone seized at the warehouse, in which Genevieve's voice coolly discussed plans to control the Toretti assets, eliminate obstacles, and use Zoe as leverage. Brielle agreed to testify under her real identity, and when Paige asked if she was ready, because this meant the entire world would know who she was, Brielle said she had hidden her name to enter that house to protect her niece, and now she would speak her real name to protect her niece in court. The purpose hadn't changed. On the day of the hearing at the Maricopa County Family Court, the courtroom was smaller than people imagined. Low ceiling, fluorescent lights, hard wooden benches, no jury, because this was an emergency custody matter rather than a criminal trial. Only the judge, the attorneys, and those involved. Ryland entered holding Zoe's hand, the child wearing a pale blue dress, hair neatly brushed, large eyes scanning the room with the quiet fear of a child who had learned to be afraid without crying. Brielle walked beside them, gripping her document folder. Donovan stood behind, expressionless, eyes sweeping the room by reflex. Paige Whitmore sat at the petitioner's table with a thick case file, and the gaze of a lawyer Brielle immediately recognized as someone who didn't just want to win, but wanted to protect. Genevieve arrived at court and for the first time wore no mask of tears. She was dressed in black, hair pulled tight, posture straight, face hard as stone, as if she understood that acting no longer worked and had shifted to another strategy: defiance. She sat at the respondent's table beside Harlan Prescott, a 55-year-old attorney known for defending the elite in Phoenix. Expensive gray suit, silver hair, deep voice, The kind of lawyer who made a living turning truth into something complicated enough to plant doubt. Harlan spoke first. He talked for 10 minutes in polished tones about misunderstandings, about an emotionally unstable father, about a child easily influenced by adults around her, about a nanny using a false name to infiltrate the family. Therefore, her testimony couldn't be trusted, about the lack of any direct witness who saw his client push the child. He spoke smoothly, convincingly, the kind of speech that without evidence made listeners begin to doubt even what they knew to be true. Paige let him finish without interruption, without objection, without impatience. When Harlan sat down, Paige stood, and she didn't speak beautifully. She spoke clearly. "Your Honor, before ruling on custody, this court needs to hear a recording, not opinion, not rumor, the respondent's own voice, recorded in her own home, describing specific actions. I request that it be played." The judge looked at Genevieve. Genevieve remained still, but her fingers tightened on the edge of the table until the knuckles whitened. Harlan tried to stand to object, but the judge raised a hand in a brief motion and said 2 words, "It'll be heard." When the recording began playing through the small speaker on the judge's desk, the air in the courtroom changed. Genevieve's cold voice filled the confined space. Not the crying voice from the hospital, not the sweet voice she used with Zoe, but her real voice, the voice without an audience, speaking to Frankie about control, about eliminate, about leverage, about how to use the Torres assets, about how to keep the child as a shield, each sentence dropping into the room like stones thrown into still water. There was no shouting in the recording, and that was the most frightening part, because everything was said in the ordinary tone of someone discussing business rather than the destruction of a child's life. Zoe sat beside Ryland holding his hand, squeezing tighter every time Genevieve's voice sounded, and Ryland squeezed back, his large fingers enclosing her small hand, holding her as if keeping her from falling again. Not from a balcony this time, but from memory. The judge stopped the recording before it finished. He didn't need to hear more. His voice was dry, firm, stripped of excess emotion. "What I just heard does not resemble a domestic dispute. It resembles a clear and present danger to this minor. I am granting emergency temporary custody to the father effective immediately, with a full no-contact order for the respondent pending further criminal investigation." Harlan attempted to rise again, but there was nothing left to save. Genevieve looked at Paige with hatred, looked at Ryland with the familiar cold gaze, then for the first time lowered her eyes when the judge delivered the final sentence Ryland would remember for the rest of his life. The priority in this courtroom is the child, not the adult's image. That same day, federal investigators working with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office entered Torres Estate under a search warrant Donovan had quietly arranged through old contacts at the Drug Enforcement Administration. The hidden basement was exposed, the concealed panel, the locked room, the private cameras, the safe, the forged passports, all photographed, collected, documented by specialists working without noise or drama, only the click of cameras and the scratch of pens. The mansion was sealed, yellow police tape wrapped around the iron gates, and the house Ryland once called home became a crime scene. What followed was no longer in his hands, and for the first time in a very long time that didn't frighten him but brought relief, because he had held everything too tightly for too long, and the result had nearly cost him the only thing that truly mattered. That night, the penthouse in Old Town Scottsdale wasn't home, but it was the first safe place in a very long time, and sometimes safety mattered more than home. The penthouse sat on the top floor of a building Ryland had bought with cash 3 years earlier, under a shell company name. The kind of place with no paperwork leading back to Torres, no presence in any record, existing outside the system for moments exactly like this one. Brielle cooked chicken soup from what was in the penthouse refrigerator. A simple soup with chicken broth, carrots, celery, small pasta, and salt. Not a luxury dish, but the one Celeste used to make whenever Brielle was sick. And when Brielle set the hot bowl in front of Zoe with 2 slices of toasted sourdough, the child ate slowly and quietly but finished everything, and that was enough. After dinner, Zoe lay on the sofa, with the old stuffed bear Brielle had managed to bring from Torres Estate before it was sealed. The bear Zoe hugged every night. The bear Genevieve once hid to frame Brielle, and now it rested in the child's arms, as if it had never been lost. Zoe fell asleep faster than Brielle expected, probably because her body was exhausted, after carrying more in one day than a 6-year-old should carry in a lifetime. Ryland sat on the floor beside the sofa, with his back against the chair leg, lights off. only the city glow through the tall windows, casting shadows across his face, and he watched his daughter sleep as if afraid that if he closed his eyes, she'd disappear again. Donovan stood outside the penthouse door, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, eyes on the elevator, keeping silent watch like a guard who didn't need applause. When Zoe's breathing grew steady and deep, Brielle pulled a light blanket over her and stepped onto the balcony. Ryland was already there, leaning on the railing and looking down at the lights of Old Town Scottsdale below, and when Brielle joined him, he didn't turn around, but he knew she was there because he'd learned her footsteps without remembering when. The desert night air was cooler than the day, dry, carrying the scent of creosote and cooling earth, and they stood side by side without speaking for a long moment, the kind of silence that felt light rather than heavy, the silence of two people who'd been through too much together in too short a time and didn't know where to begin. Ryland spoke first, voice low, eyes still on the street. "You have every right to hate me, you know." Brielle didn't answer immediately. She held the railing and thought of every reason she should hate him. How he'd cut Celeste off from her. How he'd been absent when Celeste needed him. How he'd closed the investigation. How he'd let Genevieve into the house. Then she thought of everything she'd seen. How he'd lunged to catch Zoe without a second's thought. How he'd cried alone in front of Celeste's photo at midnight. How he'd knelt a step away from his daughter in the dark warehouse so he wouldn't startle her. How he'd held Zoe's hand in the courtroom, as if keeping her from falling. Brielle said she'd come here to hate him, but she'd seen him run for Zoe and cry alone for her sister, and she couldn't hate a man who was trying. Ryland turned to look at her, and in the city light, his eyes weren't the eyes of a boss or a father, just the eyes of a 36-year-old man, exhausted and wounded, looking at the only person besides his daughter he wanted to trust. He said Celeste once told him her little sister was the strongest person she knew. Paused, then said, "Now I understand why." Brielle cried. Not the kind of crying from pain she'd done too many times over the past 2 years. Not the fear crying from the hospital or the warehouse, but a different kind. The cry of someone who'd carried a burden alone for too long and was finally seen, finally told, "I see it. I know. You're strong." Tears slid down her cheeks in silence, and she didn't wipe them away because she didn't need to hide anymore. Not from this man. Ryland lifted his hand to her face, rough palm and scarred fingers from years she didn't want to ask about. But his touch was gentle, so gentle she barely felt it, as if he was afraid she'd break, as if he knew the woman before him looked strong but had been cracked for a long time, and he didn't want to be the one to crack her further. He wiped her tears with his thumb, slow, then let his hand rest on her cheek, leaned in and stopped a breath from her lips, not closer, giving her the choice, because Ryland Toretti had taken everything he wanted in life by force, but this he wouldn't take, this he'd wait for. Brielle closed her eyes and leaned in. The kiss was brief and slow, salty with both their tears. Not the cinematic kiss of movies, but the kiss of two people who'd been hurt too much touching for the first time without masks or schemes. Nothing between them but the truth that they stood together on a balcony, looking at city lights, and both wanted to believe there was still something worth beginning after everything. The next morning, Zoe woke on the sofa with the stuffed bear still in her arms, Arizona sunlight spilling through the windows and gilding her face, and she saw Brielle asleep on the chair beside her, head tilted, hand still resting on Zoe's blanket. Zoe didn't call out. She gently shook Brielle's hand and whispered, "Miss Brie, are you my mommy's sister?" Brielle opened her eyes, startled, not yet understanding. Zoe continued, "I heard Daddy say it last night, so you're my auntie, right?" Brielle looked into those blue eyes so painfully like Celeste's, and she didn't hide anymore because she didn't need to. She pulled Zoe into her arms, crying and laughing at the same time, the kind of cry laugh that only came when joy and grief arrived together, and she said, "Yes, baby. I'm your mom's little sister. I'm your aunt." Zoe hugged Brielle's neck tight with the strength of a 6-year-old, who was realizing for the first time she wasn't as alone as she thought, that someone in the world shared her mother's blood, and that person had been here all along. And she whispered into Brielle's shoulder, "Then don't ever leave. Pinky promise." Brielle held out her pinky. Zoe hooked her tiny finger around it, and they squeezed, light but firm. The kind of promise only children and those who truly loved them understood was more sacred than any contract. Several months passed, and everything changed. Not fast, not loudly, not through a single dramatic decision, but through small days laid side by side like bricks, slow yet steady. Zoe began attending child therapy 3 sessions a week at a small clinic in Scottsdale, with a pediatric psychologist Paige Whitmore recommended, not because the child was broken, but because she deserved to learn that fear had a name, and once fear had a name, it couldn't rule her anymore. Because knowing how to name what frightened you was the first step to standing up to it. Ryland went to therapy too, and for the first time in 36 years of living, he sat in front of a stranger and told the truth about himself. Not Ryland Toretti the boss, not Ryland Toretti the powerful man, but simply Ryland, a father who'd been absent too long, a husband who hadn't protected his wife, a man who'd chosen an empire over the truth, and now lived with that choice every night. In every session, the same idea returned like a light hammer tapping the most tender place. That power couldn't replace presence, money couldn't buy back lost time, and the only thing that could repair the past was action in the present. Ryland slowly withdrew from the underground world, not through speeches or announcements, but by handing each operation and route to Donovan one by one with a clear instruction. Legalize it or shut it down. There was no third option. Donovan didn't ask why because he knew why. He'd seen Ryland hold Zoe on the warehouse floor and understood that some things changed a person, not through logic but through a moment, and that moment had already arrived. New routines formed. Every morning Ryland woke before Zoe, went to the kitchen, and even though he couldn't make smiley-face pancakes like Brielle, he could pour milk, cut fruit, and sit at the table waiting for his daughter to come down. And when Zoe came down and saw her father already there each morning, she stopped checking to see if he'd disappear. Because he didn't disappear. He was there, today and tomorrow and the day after that. He drove Zoe to school, he picked her up, he sat by her bed reading at night, and he didn't go out after she fell asleep anymore. Brielle stayed, not as a nanny, not as Brielle Carter, but as Brielle Lawson, her aunt by blood, family, someone who belonged here by blood and by choice. After the seal was lifted, Toretti Estate was no longer home, and Ryland didn't want it to be home anymore because every wall held a memory he wanted to leave behind. With Paige's help and a nonprofit specializing in domestic abuse, he converted the mansion into a support center for abused children, and when it came time to name it, Zoe didn't hesitate for a second, her voice clear and steady as she looked straight ahead and said Celeste's Haven. She said it the way one placed a flower exactly where it belonged, without tears or trembling, with the certainty of a child who knew her mother deserved to be remembered by something living, not just by a grave. The mansion changed, not through money but through purpose. The living room became a group space. The basement turned into counseling rooms. More trees were planted in the yard for shade, and the once cold white walls now held children's drawings, bright with color, of homes, of trees, of hands holding hands. Zoe brought her own drawing to hang in the main hallway. The picture of 3 people holding hands she'd drawn months earlier, the one with Miss Bree standing in the middle. And when a new child arrived with fear in their eyes and shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear, Zoe didn't ask much or say much. She simply sat beside that child and offered a colored pencil, because sometimes a pencil was a door, and sometimes the door only needed to be just wide enough for a child to step through. One late autumn day, Ryland drove Brielle and Zoe to Green Acres Cemetery in Scottsdale, where Celeste rested beneath a simple granite headstone etched with her name and 2 dates. Zoe held white flowers, walked slowly across the grass, stopped before her mother's grave, and stood still for a long moment, as if waiting for the wind to stop so her words wouldn't be blown away. Then she spoke softly, the clear voice of a 6-year-old speaking to the person she loved most. "Hi, Mommy. We're okay now. Daddy's really here, and Auntie Bree is here too." Ryland knelt beside his daughter with one knee on the grass, placed his hand on the cold stone, and he didn't apologize with a long speech. He just told the truth. "I failed you when you needed me most, but I won't fail our girl, never again." Brielle stood behind them, placed her hand on the headstone beside Ryland's, and cried silently, without sound, because no words were needed when her sister already knew she was here and would always be here. Zoe placed the white flowers on the grave, then took from her pocket a folded piece of paper, unfolded it, revealing a drawing of 4 people holding hands: Daddy, Auntie Bree, Zoe, and Mommy, with Mommy having wings and floating above, her hand still connected to the 3 below by a long golden curve Zoe called the love string. She laid the drawing on the grave like a letter that didn't need an envelope. That night, back at the penthouse, Zoe fell asleep early after dinner. Ryland carried her to bed, tucked her in, turned on the small star-shaped nightlight on her bedside, and left the door slightly open the way Zoe liked, because she still wasn't used to sleeping with the door closed, and maybe never would be, and that was okay. Half asleep, Zoe murmured, her voice as soft as breath. Daddy. Ryland sat beside the bed, held her hand, and said, I'm here. Tomorrow, too. She smiled with her eyes closed, and fell fully asleep, her breathing even and light like a passing breeze. Ryland stood, stepped into the hallway, and saw Brielle leaning against the doorframe, eyes warm, saying nothing, and needing to say nothing, because everything that needed to be said had already been said through the months, through pancakes each morning, lullabies each night, tears on the warehouse floor, pinkies hooked together, and a salty kiss on the balcony. Ryland walked over and took her hand, his large and rough, hers smaller but no weaker, and they stood in the dim hallway, listening to Zoe's steady breathing through the cracked door, both understanding that love wasn't proven by one heroic moment in a crisis, but by presence, by patience, by time given every day, because time given sincerely was also the strongest protection there was. From this story came a clear and painful but necessary lesson. Love wasn't measured by promises, but by daily actions. Sometimes we believed working non-stop was caring, that earning more money was protection, but real love lived in presence, in listening at the right moment, in looking into your child's eyes, in noticing small changes before they became tragedy. Children spoke truth through their hearts, and when a child was afraid it should never be taken lightly or delayed, action was required, listening was required, protection was required. Family didn't need to be perfect, it only needed to be steadfast. And when someone had failed, when someone had been wrong, change was still possible, but only through action, never through empty words. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself in it, saw someone you loved in it, or saw a lesson you wanted to remember, please like this video, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories. We'd truly like to know how this story made you feel, whether it connected to your real life, whether there was a moment that made you pause and think of someone. Please write it in the comments below because we read every single one, and we want to listen to what comes from the deepest part of your hearts, because those shared feelings are what keep us telling stories that touch human emotion every day. We also wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and calm days spent beside those you love. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next video.